Evolving barbaric hieroglyphs, I spit my gifts, shift your surface with vernacular skill. The rawest live, touching down like meteors, none other than black gods. Stones in my timepiece coming from black stars. Negativity for keep far away from doors. Single-mindedly destroying the ops and the odds. Just another warrior's quest. The past may get rest. Demons coming for my crown, get beheaded like the next. These blessings never threats, just to verbalize a message, catching energies of critics. All the Atari get deaded. Pray I stay alert on the field, be skillmatic in anything my enemies deal. Be dead actions, I proceed just like I lead beneath it. So many seas to win. It's our time to align stars. So spirits lead. Who could war with me? Catastrophically or audibly, given no choice by God's law. I'm Lucifer on streets.
All right. Well, today what we're going to talk about, the name of the class is the de-evolution of social integrity. And in addressing that, we're going to basically break it down to some kind of question and answer. So the flow of it is, what is integrity? What does it mean to devolve? How do we determine social norms? How do we know when it has the line has been crossed? Who determines the line in the sand? What are some of the social conditions of de-evolution? What is needed to recalibrate our position in society? And what can we do as individuals to solve the problem? So when addressing that, let's go to the first slide here. Integrity. What is integrity? Adherence to moral and ethical principles, soundness of moral character, the state of being whole, entire or undiminished. The incline of population brings an incline in the ways needed to control a greater number of people. It is direct injected social engineering that has manipulated the rate of decay to match the rate of population. The ability to traverse the globe via the current state of telecommunications have made the world appear to be smaller, but actually is globally more corporized. In saying this, what's important about starting the tone, within our studies as Panthers, we always start off by creating a definition, which helps us to create a base of what we're discussing. And now when we talk about adhering to moral and ethical principles, that is really the essence of what we get into, because the morality and the rate in terms of how that morality decays is something that we want to cross-examine and make sure that we all can see how the pattern operates. And the nature of this class is basically to do just that. So with that being said, our integrity is shaped by the illusion of civil conducive congruency, which is the art of population balance weighed against the perceptive gradual moral leniency. And what we mean by gradual moral leniency is that, again, as you deal with population growth, you deal with more exposure of different situations based upon the fact that the populations are easily more connected. And therefore, from a cultural perspective, you have so many cross-cultural concepts and cross-cultural representation and ethics that gets blended and meshed and brought to the world's attention. And so again, we have to see that as being the fact that the world is actually becoming more corporized. But as we apply moral leniency, it is how you address the fact that the population, how you address the offset of the population growth. This inducing pattern is the silent weapon of global growth, built in to calibrate the erosion and dissipate conscious normalcy. And so again here, the focus and or key thing to harness is the fact that you're dissipating conscious normalcy, which basically means as time moves on with the rate of population growth, what is considered to be norm changes within each generation. The amount of power a nation has in reference to the dependence the amount of power a nation has in reference to its dependence on bordering nations, the rate of exchange and trade, currency index, financial debt and aid, the military occupation, determines the ability to levy population, civil conducive congruence balance. Basically, by saying that is when we look at the United States and it being a world power, and you look at other countries that may not be have as much resources or as much wealth, the way that they deal with civil conductive congruence is a lot less of a factor, because you have other things that affect population, other things that affects livelihood, and other things that affect the rate of death within that nation, and the exposure or the ability for the masses of people in that nation to be able to rise up and make change. With poor nations, the average citizen has less of an ability to affect the political operation of that nation, which tends to have, which is why a lot of those third world nations tend to have dictatorships from that standpoint. Whereas within the United States, operating as a republic, and the way it operates, and being pretty much the world power, um, the offset has to be more secluded in terms of how you separate the citizens of the country from politics and from being able to be involved in politics. And so, from that standpoint, that goes hand in hand with the idea of how you address the integrity as that nation progresses. So, what does it mean to devolve? On an individual level, this means to reduce in generative power as it relates to the environmental conditions or genetic replication. On a family level, this genetic reduction in potency means the level of neutralization to the family unit. This will have a significant impact on the seeded generation, and the formal influence of the parent uh, will sustain a downgrade in its ability to convey experiences to the youth, thereby not allowing the next line to advance without repeat of actions that will generate loss of foundational stability gained from the past. With each imprint of this devolved cycle, the situation worsens and physical, mental, spiritual extinction moves into foreseeable proximity, uh, propensity. And what we mean by this, and to break this down a little easier, is that when we talk about, and we discuss this in skill level number one within the membership, as you talk about physical, mental, and social, as well as individual, family, and collective growth. When we talk about devolving, as a family devolves, then again, each generation within that family strand has less and less ability to be able to be in control of its environment. Whether we talk about the social, economic, or political environment, whether we talk about again the person's mental, physical, and spiritual awareness and ability to impact themselves as they progress throughout life. So from that standpoint, as that family structure devolves, which again is based upon and backed by the idea of dealing with the de-evolution of social integrity, that family structure and that family's ability to be able to impact the collective operation of the people and the way we operate to move toward justice, and as we get into later, self-determination has less and less of an influence. And not only has less and less of an influence, but remember, because of this de-evolution or devolving, the individual's consciousness of what is happening and what is taking place, and their position of actual personal power diminishes as well. So they have less awareness of the fact that they can play a part in the overall scheme of getting themselves back in power, or granting power to the people once again. So the idea here is to deal with spoon feeding poison, so to speak, or mental poison to the masses of the people. And so that's what we get into when we talk about devolve. But now we want to talk about it as it applies to the collective level. And on a collective level, social devolve is basically devolution, which is a term that a lot of people are not familiar with. Devolution. So now we want to get into that, and that kind of really goes into the essence of political power, the essence of why in the United States and in the world power structure in particularly, we find that people, the masses of the people, don't have a real good connection to what it takes to deal with the political figures and the political structures in which they operate from. So we find ourselves to be powerless against the system simply because of our disconnect. And that also goes into why the background you see here of a puppeteer holding strings. So they just want to bring that to your attention in case y'all didn't notice that. So now, in dealing with devolution, it is a statutory deregulation of powers from a central government of a sovereign state to govern at the subnational level, such as a region or a local level. It is a form of administrative decentralization, devolved territories that have the power to make legislative relevant to an area, thus granting them a higher level of autonomy. In the United States, only the federal government and the state governments are sovereign. And that's the key point when we talk about this. Legal relationships with Native American tribes and their government structures are the jurisdiction of the federal government. Territories under the direct jurisdiction of Congress. Territorial governments are thus devolved by act of Congress. Political subdivisions of the state, such as a county or municipality, are a type of devolved government and are defined by individual state constitutions and laws. Another point of this goes into the United States Capitol, which is a district in which Washington's District of Columbia, or Washington, D.C., and that's a key word that I want y'all to just look into, key phrase, should I say, that I want you to look into in terms of it's being referred to as Washington's District of Columbia. That's a whole nother class into itself in terms of going into the science behind the aspects of that. So Washington, D.C. offers an illustration of devolved government. The district is separate from any state, and it has its own elected government. In many ways, on a day-to-day basis, it operates much like other states, with its own laws, courts, systems, etc. However, the government and the 50 states are reserved a broad range of powers in the U.S. Constitution, and most of their laws cannot be voided by any act of U.S. federal government. The District of Columbia, by contrast, is constitutionally under the sole control of the United States Congress, which creates a current district government by statute. Any law passed by the district legislature can be nullified by congressional action, and indeed the district government could be significantly altered or eliminated entirely by simply a majority vote in Congress. And this is important to recognize simply because a lot of people are not aware of how sovereignty works or the freedoms work within the territories of Native Americans within the United States. And even to give you a greater point of attention, we want to talk about Puerto Rico, which became a U.S. territory in 1898 following the Spanish-American War, which has some measure of self-rule but limited representation in Washington. Its economy has languished due to the loss of federal tax provisions, accumulation of massive debt, and the ill effects of natural disasters, the corona pandemic, government mismanagement, and population decline. And that's just one of the examples. But now Puerto Ricans have fought for a referendum to make the territory a state. The 16th such action took place on May the 16th, 2020, with the previous one having taken place in 2017. The referendum was non-binding as the power to grant statehood lies with the U.S. Congress. The referendum was not approved by the U.S. Department of Justice under the Trump administration. And so the point is, regardless of the people coming together and attempting to work toward changing the dynamics in which Puerto Rico operates, ultimately it's up to Congress to grant them the right to be able to operate as a higher level of power. And so with that recognition, again, talking about devolution and how it operates, we must see how power structures utilize this on their behalf, and to make them to strengthen themselves. So the United States and other countries follow the same suit, have these territories. And so these territories they have basically serve as extensions of the government without them having the same level of power as a state may have. And so therefore, by not having that power, and also by being regulated to everything on a federal level, it causes them to also suffer more in terms of how the economics operate, as which people pretty much are aware of how, like for instance, in Washington D.C. is basically the United States Capitol slap in the middle of a ghetto. Well, why is it a ghetto? A lot of it has to do with the operations of how this devolved state is structured and set up. So for instance, like when we was talking about Puerto Rico, so when it dealt with the national disasters, it's limited on its ability to seek foreign aid simply because it's a United States territory. And being a United States territory is no different than some other foreign country trying to step foot on the United States soil for whatever reason without having the proper authority to do so, since it is a territory, or and technically from that standpoint, the land belongs to the United States. And so by the United States operating on that caliber within these land masses, it renders the people of those areas to have limited amounts of power in terms of how they structure their lives and how they operate. And so that's one thing that a lot of people are not aware of in terms of just territorial rule, and why there's so much conflict around it at times. Again, depending on the nature of how the territory is established and what it's established for, and how things operate. You even have Hawaii, if y'all are familiar with that, here recently started talking about coming up with ways for them to separate themselves from the United States. Any questions before we move forward? Anybody got any comments? Like I said, we got a small class, so y'all should be able to interact with us. Y'all still there? Somebody at least speak for me.
No questions. Right. I'm just reading over the slide that was before this one.
Gotcha. Okay. All right, let me keep it moving here. So how do we determine social norms? This is answered by first giving account to the language of being self-determined. To have the control of self is also referred to in the great axiom of know thyself. The 87th African proverb, the kingdom of heaven is within you, and whoever shall know himself shall find it, is also a good reference point for that. But in playing off of the language here of what we're talking about when we say, how do we determine social norms? It is important that as a people, and this is how we kind of dive into the whole overall discussion that we're getting into, it is important that we are able to distinguish our different aspects of trifactor power. That's why y'all were introduced, Panther membership was introduced to this in skill level number 1, when we talk about recognizing the individual, the family, and the collective. Because when we talk about our power base and gear that toward the discussion of social norms, again, most people give away their power. So we're going to actually talk about how that is naturally done here within the United States and in countries in general. So in saying that, the definition here, and this is hyphenated for a reason, so I would advise y'all to actually look up how that is separated and play off the esoteric aspect of what that can go into. Dealing with etymology of words and their usage is real important, especially when you dive into just how powerful words are in terms of controlling or manipulation of life. So in dealing with this definition, expands from inward to the mirror, the all in connective reflection, the need to manipulate the body and entice control from the head downward, the central nervous system, emotional body, to the extended parts reflects the same paradigm exhibited by humanity. Therefore, to control the many by way of the few is not good or evil. The nervous system suppresses the signals in order to isolate the channel of influence needed to deliver a precision message. Our life is the same, only the balance is diseased, and those holding the tools of building are injecting artificial mental erosion into the effects in an effect to address civil conductive congruency. And basically what we mean by that is that the more the population is unaware of its power, and the more the population gives away its power, the more the population is not involved in the policy making, in the actual day-to-day operating of how everything comes together, then it allows a smaller group of people to, control the wealth of the world. And with that operation, there is a buffer that's created between those that have and have not, as well as those that are in the know and those that are not in the know. And so that's why it's important. And I went back to the idea here of know thyself. We hear that all the time, but most people, it just really doesn't resonate with them. And that's why the information being brought up in this discussion today is being exposed, so that the majority of people, even if a lot of this doesn't quite make sense yet, the idea is for you to read it and for you to digest it, watch the video multiple times, and a lot of this to start making sense, especially as you start looking at news in the political arena, how things operate. You'll be able to see how the pieces of the puzzle fit together. Go to the next slide here. So again, as we address the idea here of how this works on a collective level, dealing with determined social norms, we go into self-determination. And dealing with self-determination is recorded through the lens of the birth certificate within the United States. So self-determination, like I said, is recorded through the lens of birth certificate. This is important because when we talk about the sovereign individual, it's a whole nother discussion, which again can be a whole nother class into itself. We exchange our freedoms for civil rights. By accepting the exchange, we are granted the pursuit to happiness. This forgiveness and accountability, and that's important in a very powerful concept of words, the forgiveness of accountability. So I really suggest y'all recognize what that means. So the forgiveness accountability allows individualization and the luxury of specialization. It also must yield a hierarchy of control through separation in order to maintain the individual divide as a perpetual operation. This manifestation rises the institution and infrastructure of dominance. Racism is at the seat of disappointment, and the illusion of righteousness keeps those operating the tug of war between consumption and production, which is a polarity. And so that's what's important, because when we define what self-determination is, again, without true knowledge of thyself, we don't recognize how the separation of rights, and whether it be birthrights or whether it be human rights, play into the equation. And too often we rely upon our definition of civil rights as being how should I say that? As being a function that we're entitled to, because it's referred to as a right. But keep in mind, when enforceability comes into play on individual levels, this is why you see things not dished out equally across the playing field. Because again, there must be a hierarchy of control through separation. And that's what goes on here, a hierarchy of control through separation. And therefore, things are not disseminated equally across the board, because from that standpoint, not all people are considered to be equals. Not all human types are considered to be equals. And the sooner we recognize that, the more empowered we'll be in terms of operating from whatever point of view or perspective that we need to in order to gain a certain level of empowerment. So how do we know when the line has been crossed? The more we see past, and this is important in terms of how this is drawn out, the more we see past, the veil and able to remember collective hindsight, the easier it is to know when the balance of nature is beyond the yield of natural repair from any one species, aka humanity. So what we're saying about that is the key here in terms of gaining a grip over social de-evolution in order to address integrity, in order to build that from any perspective of a position within the framework of the people within a society, you have to know how to deal with collective hindsight. The problem is, too often as individuals, we refer to hindsight in terms of our personal experiences and how that defines our life and our lifestyle. But when you talk about collective hindsight, it goes into how groups of people move, which is why terrorism into it in itself is so impactful and so powerful, because trauma and fear tend to automatically deal with the concept of epigenetics in terms of the body or the genetic code finds ways to navigate and deal with survival of a situation or a condition, which causes it to go on autopilot. But now when we talk about critical thinking and we talk about being able to pierce through and see through the veil, which again is talking about the past or how they pass, so to speak, that is something that has to be practiced. That is something that has to be experienced and then maintained. So it is not a natural occurring thing, especially within the guise of how this society raises us and births us, which again goes back to the concept of the birth certificate. So from that standpoint, because of those situations that are imposed upon humanity across the country, period, within state control, we are not able to recognize collective hindsight to the degree in which we should. This is why you continually have the same set of patterns playing out between nations, between people, and between society over and over and over again. Whereas it's always tried, those that are in power tend to try to isolate it as much as possible down to individual actions and individual people being, the actual problem versus the institution being the problem. And so that's what's important, is that we recognize that, going up to what we said here earlier, the manifestation rises the institution and the infrastructure of dominance. And racism is the seat of that appointment. So knowing that, if we harness and focus in on collective hindsight and collective action and collective synchronization, then we would have a actual fighting chance of dealing with all of these social norms or unnorms, so to speak. Anybody got any questions about what I'm saying so far? Do I need to want me to break something down a little further? So I guess silence is no. I keep moving. Okay, who determines the line in the sand? The people or the collective has the power to determine this line. And we have to just put a period right there. Because again, when you talk about self-determination, when we give away our power or give away our freedoms for civil liberties, what we do is allow that line to be defined and drawn for us. So then we actually change in terms of our status of empowerment as a people. So it is important that when you talk about who determines that we deal with a level of personal accountability. Therefore, the people or the collective have the power to determine this line. The problem is synchronization in mass action towards retrieval of power to the many. but without losing the center of self in the calibration. The overpopulated base of data controls the masses from ever having the time to obtain a large or implemented memory of what happens within a large enough pool of cross section. What we mean by that is that, again, going back to talking about collective hindsight and collective pattern recognition, what's happening is we, through the manipulation of events that take place, the masses as a collective tend to forget what it means to be synchronized. And so therefore, by having all of the people operating as quote unquote individuals dealing with the polarity of consumption versus production, we are too busy minded, whether we're actually physically busy or not. But our mind seems to be too preoccupied with substance, with data, with things that render it incapable of actually taking a larger awareness of how we all can come together and how we all fit into the operation of the planet and the operation of the universe. So then we're not able to be at the center of self, which goes back to the true essence of what we mean when we get into knowledge of self. And because of that, then that renders us from being able to synchronize. Even though we're dealing with a society and this is where we're going to start getting into soon, a society that is more connected technological wise than it has ever been before, but yet we're still have less synchronization in terms of fighting. So with that being said, the condition is changeable. We only need to recognize our base of power. What are some of the social conditions of the evolution? And so this is where we start really diving into the weaponization of social media, the weaponization of what's taking place within our current time within society as it applies to technology. So using the backdrop of social media, we must discuss the physiological effects, the rapid growth of modern telecommunications, has on the user's overexposure. So again, when we talk about the psychological effects, the point being, this gets into what's referred to now as cyber psychology. So we deal with an actual science that is built around users of technology that is moving at a high pace of operation in a production. So cyber psychology is the study of the human mind and behavior and how the culture of technology, specifically virtual reality and social media, affects them. Mainstream research studies focus on the effects of the internet and cyberspace on the psychology of individuals and groups. Areas within the study include addiction to computers and internet, regressive behaviors in cyberspace, personality types in cyberspace, transference to computers, online identity, online relationships, and online gender switching, etc. While much research of this field is based around internet usage, cyber psychology also includes the study of psychological ramifications of artificial intelligence and virtual reality. Now, in order to try to get a little bit of participation, have anybody just comment, have anyone heard of anybody was already aware of cyber psychology before today on the class?
I wasn't. I've never heard of cyber psychology. It makes sense hearing about it, but I don't think I've ever heard it in that term.
Gotcha. Now, again, what's important about recognizing this, and what is important, period, about really the study of psychology, and this is also why I often refer back to telling people to really dig into the papers that have been declassified on MK Ultra, because that project, in the depths of the information that was collected during it, and all of the different branches of operation and experimentation that go into that project through the umbrellas of the project, are a real treasure trove of the awareness and the impact and the power of the mind and the power of how there's so much potential untapped that most of us never use. And so knowing this, the study of psychology period has many branches that most people are just not even familiar with. And again, we talked earlier about how certain rights, quote unquote, are granted to us, which allows specializations. By having the ability to have specializations on any particular thing, this is what causes breakthroughs in technology, breakthroughs in when we think about technology, that's not simply only look at technology as being physical objects, but technological advancements also have to do with breakthroughs in what's happening through the physiology of the body and natural environments as well. So technology even plays a role oftentimes in what we call the biosphere or biogenetics and bio operations. So don't just simply think of technology as being like a computer or a cell phone or something like that, but there's all types of breakthroughs that are tied into the terminology, so to speak, of technology. So let's keep moving here to go and dive into the different areas of study within cyber psychology. And real quick here, let me see. This is just a chart that just shows you some of the cycles of trauma that we experience through the virtual world based upon how it is weaponized just against the day-to-day operation of humanity and of people. Because again, we're talking about an advancement in a product that is able to be weaponized and manipulated and used against the masses just based upon extracting data and creating certain behavior patterns. So let me go now into what's referred to as social media and ADHD connection. The emerging body of research suggests that the internet, addiction, and unhealthy social media activity can compound the effects of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. The ADHD brain is already one that struggles with motivation, activation, organizing behaviors, managing time, and maintaining focus. The unique challenges that result are prime variabilities to the common pitfalls of technology use. Although many factors contribute to ADHD, including genetics, environment, and parenting lifestyles, a lifestyle centered on television, computer gaming, mobile devices will increase the risk of ADHD. When kids play computer games, their minds are processing information in a much different way than kids who are predominantly involved in physical outdoor activities. Recent studies have shown that playing computer games causes neurological junctions to build very short-term attention links needed to be rewarded frequently. As a result, this oversaturated mental connection causes unrealistic expectations when applied to real-life requirements. The expression of not receiving instant wins and rewards for participating in life causes emotional hyperbole and explosive outbursts. The ability to deal with basic stress of life will reinforce an escape into a virtual world, sucking the user into a more addictive cyber world realities. And so when we talk about these concepts, it should be real obvious as to how a lot of this we can see in ourselves in terms of how social media manipulates us. But we hadn't looked at it from this view or from this standpoint. So it's real important that we recognize this stuff here. So comparison and low self-esteem. This is a real big one. Social media can be deceptive when a user sees only the joyous or entertaining experiences in a friend's life and compares them to his or her own lesser experiences. Underestimating peers' negative experiences correlates with greater loneliness and lowers the overall life satisfaction outside of the virtual world. Inviting constant comparisons inevitably lowers self-esteem and feelings of self-worth. Hence, Facebook and other social media accounts appear to exploit this vulnerability in human nature. And when we talk about exploiting vulnerabilities in human nature, that goes back to why I made reference to Project MK Ultra, because a lot of the things that technology is being built around now has to do with some of the breakthroughs and findings of the study of human behavior. So again, I can't stress enough how important it is to just be aware of those kind of things and take the time when you can to really dive into that. So another thing here that coincides with this will be depression. Decreased self-esteem can increase depression. Facebook specifically is criticized for causing depression, especially among teenage users. The study included that frequent Facebook use invoked feelings of depression and inadequacy. The research tracked on a moment-to-moment basis throughout the day how a person's mood fluctuated during time spent on Facebook and whether or not they modified their Facebook usage. Results suggested that as participants spend more time on Facebook, their feelings of well-being decreased and feelings of depression increased. Another study found that participants in the highest quartile for social media site visits per week were at an increase of likelihood of experiencing depression. Anybody got something to add, or does any of this stuff sound familiar just in terms of any experiences people have had on social media?
Yeah, I feel like I was actually just talking about this with one of my friends recently of just the impact of social media. It's like we're connected, right, to so many people, but at the same time we're not, right? It's like this false connection and false community. And I think, especially within mental health, that contributes to loneliness. Even though it's like this irony because you feel like you shouldn't be lonely, right? And you're seeing all these people that are living their best life, but then you're actually just seeing it on your screen, right? You're not having interactions, you're not having conversations, you're not being challenged, right, by other people at all. So, really interesting.
Thank you. On the same note here, another area here will be social isolation and ostracism. Excessive social media usage increased feelings of social isolation, which is basically what you just talked about. That is, authentic, real life social interactions were replaced by virtual relationships. Additionally, one study found that social rejection or ostracism in an immersive virtual environment has a negative impact emotionally, in the same way that ostracism negatively impacts emotions in real life context. The size of an individual's online social network is closely linked to brain structure associated with social cognition. And this is where it gets deep when you say that, because that's another key element to recognize in terms of things being weaponized against the population or against the individual's coherent ability to see what they're doing to themselves as a result of how they clicking things and how they decide to coordinate and structure their page or their social media footprint and use.
I guess I wanted to just add something too that I think kind of connects to this in some ways, and I think you brought it up previously, but like of how like I know of like a lot of my friends and colleagues, like when they feel uncomfortable, where do they go to, right? They like kind of even explain like a disassociation and just scrolling on their phone, right? When there's something going wrong, when they don't want to address something that's maybe more complicated, right? Like community issues, societal issues, what do we do? Just, it's much easier, much more maybe quote unquote rewarding to just look at cool things on your phone or on your computer.
And see, that even goes right back to the whole point of how you create this instant gratification factor that plays upon our ability to actually critically think as it applies to real life world scenarios, because the having access to data in quote unquote information so instantaneous on our phones fights against our natural ability to be able to problem solve. And now when we talk about being able to problem solve, what people take for granted is the fact that, for instance, just going into basic academics within school, people take for granted the power of learning how to properly read, the power of learning how to be able to retain information or memory in itself. So from that standpoint, when we have access to technology or resources that allows instantaneous results or instantaneous answers tend to replace solutions. And we've talked about this in the past, to where how the word solution and answers tend to be interchanged. And by them being interchanged and used to define one another, it actually takes the power away from real solutions. So like going back to one of the things you just brought up in dealing with some of the social conditions that we face collectively as a people. So instead of us actually having legitimate solutions, again, based upon addressing and looking at what we refer to as collective hindsight. In other words, historical examples or historical information that can be used from previous generations to make sure that either we don't go down the same area of mistakes, or we take the lessons of success and be able to use that and build upon that foundation. But what happens is, because of our instantaneous answers, we are left without our ability to be able to critically think, and therefore add upon how things may have worked out in the past, and even be aware of what happened in the past, to the degree of being able to have a valid approach and be visionary enough to see something before it happens and already have a way to address it as you're moving into that lane. But see, that again takes collective hindsight. And most of the time, because of the way society has been weaponized against us, we have disconnected with our ability to have that visionary type of awareness of a population, a global population, and the things that happen to people regardless of where they are, who they are, and ethnicity, and so on and so forth. But there are certain types of connections that happens to all of humanity that can be gained and learned from throughout historical awareness. And so I just wanted to point that out. Well, let me see. So I think I last left off saying the size of an individual's online social networks closely linked to brain structure associated with social cognition. So again, that leads right back into why I say it's important to study MK Ultra. So this is the funny one to me, but this is so true in terms of how people pattern themselves off of social media. Fear of missing out, the acronym FOMO, a byproduct of social media use that can be the fear of missing out. This fear develops from a user's repetitive and obsessive status checking of friends, status updates, and posts related to social events or celebrations, resulting in a feeling of being left out if those events are not experienced. There is also a closely related fear of being missed, or the fear of being virtually invisible. This fear involves the obsessive need to provide constant status updates on one's own personal day-to-day life, movements, travels, events, etc. Unable to unplug. There is evidence that suggests this type of anxiety is a mediating factor in both increased social media use and decrease of self-esteem. And so this here again plays heavily into the idea, and not the idea, but the factual concept of what happens as we tend to disconnect from real life society and move into the virtual environment as being our place of choice of collective empowerment, which is a false sense of collective empowerment. But because of that, the fear of missing out of real life tends to lessen, and our fear of missing out of virtual reality and virtual life and virtual events, which have no substance to terms of how you are really being impacted in the actual world, play out. Then we see how, from our earlier discussion when we exchange freedoms for civil liberties, now we're doing the same thing, just on a larger, grander scale from a mental status and mental standpoint and a psychological standpoint. So whereas our physical freedoms would normally get exchanged again for civil rights, now we jump into the virtual world and we start doing the same thing to our mental capacities and our psychological awareness as it applies to even just being human and even existing on the planet, being in a position to where we can physically take charge and have a meaningful life and be at a position of self-determination as a people. Those things are exchanged. And so therefore we are stuck in this zone to where we have fears of missing out of something that's taking place in the virtual world, which leads right to the next aspect, which is the addictive behavior. Studies have shown a connection between online social media such as Facebook use of addictive behaviors, emotion regulations, impulse control, and substance abuse. People are learning to access and process information more rapidly and to shift attention quickly from one task to the next. All this access and vast selection is causing some entertainment seekers to develop the constant need for instant gratification with a loss of patience. And this is important because, again, this is the physiological damage of what we are as humans. Results from a survey of university undergraduates showed that almost 10% met criteria for what investigators describe as disordered social networking use. Respondents who met criteria for Facebook addiction also reported statistically significant symptoms similar to the symptoms of addiction, such as tolerance, increased Facebook use over time, withdrawals, irritability when unable to access Facebook, and cravings to access the site. Findings suggest that they may be shared mechanisms underlining both substance and behavioral addictions. The prevalence of internet addiction varies considerably between countries and is inversely related to the quality of life. And so that's important because as we talk about the actual addictions, whether it be physical addictions to things versus our emotional addictions based upon virtualized environments, it is one and the same as it applies to the fact that it occupies your time, it occupies your attention, it occupies your awareness, it occupies your perception, and it basically seizes your entire life from that standpoint. So whether we're talking about physical addictions like crack cocaine, or we talking about addictions on social media, they can tend to have the same result on your ability to be able to be empowered as an individual. And that's what's important, because we're talking about this from a psychological and physiological standpoint. Another thing that should be pretty obvious that can happen as a result of too much screen use is sleep deprivation. Social media use can lead to lower quality of sleep. Studies conclude that countries are becoming nations of online-aholics. On the average night, people are spending 15 to 20 minutes in bed socially networking, with the peak chatting time of around 9:45 p.m. This time spent socially networking may be affecting sleep quota, as on average, respondents reported that they are getting just over 6 hours of sleep per night. And 65 respondents in the same study state that very last thing they do before they nod off at night is check their mobile phone for text message. On average, people within the study would spend around 10 minutes every night texting before falling asleep. And 4 out of 10 adults report that they have regular text communications with their friend in bed every night. Another one, and to me, this one you definitely see happening all the time, is negative relationships. One survey found that a high level of Facebook use is associated with negative relationship outcomes, such as breakups and divorce, and that these negative outcomes are magnified by conflicts about levels of Facebook use. However, this was only true for those who are or have been in relative new relationships for 3 years or less, based upon the studies. To cope with the uncertainty of a suspected romantic relationships, partner surveillance on Facebook is becoming more popular. This pattern draws skepticism between couples and lead to the end of relationships. The analytics suggest that certain behaviors on social media may be predicting negative outcomes rather than causing them. As a counter to this statistic, some may say that Facebook can be a tool to strengthen and reaffirm a relationship, as it allows for positive expressions of trust, affection, and commitment. But I do want to speak real quick on the fact that Facebook tends to definitely, when it comes to relationships, intimate relationships, tend to be used oftentimes for spying, and as a result of that, people can jump to unwarranted conclusions based upon responses to posts that are put up on Facebook or that are made, and so on and so forth. It is so easy for the imagination to run wild, especially in a virtual environment, more so than a real environment. So just keep that in mind, because now we're dealing with a virtual reality situation. Things can be so super magnified. And so that can lead to negative relationships. So what is needed to recalibrate our position in society? To recalibrate the position takes the removal of social separation, and for humanity to repair itself from the trauma of population erosion, because this is what all of this stuff we're talking about creates. We must be able to have self-control and accept the letting go of high factors of wants in order to rebuild the appetite for needing what is best for power to the people. But this would take a knowledge of personal self, family self, and collective self, all in unity. And we address this often within our teaching courses within the Black Panther Party, when we talk about our trifactor, dealing with individual, family, and the collective. But to harness and talk more on that same point, the idea here is, in order for us to really gauge and harness the ability to recalibrate ourselves in society, we have to deal with our personal traumas. We have to deal with all of the things that we just talked about in terms of what is manipulating and creating even more severe and more traumatic events for us, that couple into what we already deal with, especially within African society, as it applies to what happened throughout the Moafa or slavery, and what we continually face just through racism in general. So you already have these traumas that have stuck with you throughout your childhood, that if don't get addressed, cause us to have a type of emotional retardation based upon the rate of our psychological growth, and our emotional body does not keep up with our physical growth. And so now, in dealing with these traumas, they cause us to crystallize at certain points in time. And that inhibits us to be able to continue down the path that helps address critical thinking in terms of just having basic analytic abilities to comprehend what's really going on within the world around you, which goes into being able to be a good visionary and revolutionary to that degree as well. But because of that, when we're dealing with the weaponization of anything, and specifically for today's topic, we're talking about this as it applies to social media footprints, then these help to recreate an entirely new self, which is why we refer back to know thyself. So when we recreate a self that is fabricated based upon a a likeness of what we would like to have an appearance of, but not really willing to address things at the root level and deal with it from a solution-based perspective, and wanting to only project things from the shell perspective, it takes away our ability to have collective power again, because we're dealing with a false sense of security, a false sense of awareness, and a false identity as an individual. So if an individual is wearing a false identity, how can you expect the people to be united around a true identity, especially as it applies to overcoming the situation of domestication as it applies to being African people here in the United States? If I'm wearing this false sense of identity on a personal level, then when the people come together, that's only going to be magnified, that sense of false awareness. And so therefore empowerment could not take place. So in closing on here, what can I do as an individual to solve the problem? Open self to the acceptance of accountability and be able to heal and not dwell on victimization. Kind of what we was just saying. We must recognize the conditions of war and embrace the battles. As soldiers in war, the equipping of the proper tools will be the deciding factor in one's ability to see the path and render themselves able to take the road to self-determination and responsibility. We must be students of learning that does not seek a reward as a condition for growth, but instead sees the growth as a reward that will be self-perpetuated until physical transition. And in breaking it down a little further, basically what we're saying is that we must be students of self, of learning thyself, students of growth, and that in itself is the reward. So our reward comes in the fact that we are learning more about who we are, whether we talk about who we are on an individual level, again, family level, or community level. That reward is having the power to take power back into the hands of what you are. So within the Panther Party, we refer to that as our 3Ds, being able to define who you are, develop who you are, and then defend who you are, and then transgress that same thing within each generation behind you. Therefore, as we do that, then what we're doing is we're building what we call foundational generational advancement. And that generational advancement comes into play to bring us back around to the ability to have collective empowerment and collective action and collective direction as a people. That allows us to have a synchronization that will put us in the perspective and in the ability to have the numbers needed to make this type of change as it applies to certain things that need to happen congruently around the world, all within sync, all within time, so that we can exercise our power as a people. But unless we really understand what it means to deal with knowledge of self, these type of things would not have any ability to be foreseen on a collective level in a mass number large enough for us to be able to raise the caliber of life and raise the caliber of value and raise the caliber of impact that will allow itself to build for each generation, instead of us getting to a certain point, making headway, and then it erodes again over time, and then the next generation is finding out that, oh, this was done before, and so I can try it this way, or I can go about it this way, just modernize, and then they have to redo the whole thing again. Because every time we have a victory, we're supposed to be achieving higher levels of that victory. That is the only way you can outpace the pace of oppression, which is constantly evolving and redefining itself with time. So as students of revolution, we must be able to do the same exact thing. So with that, the only thing else is I gave a quick reference here on the 87 African proverbs, so that people can just use those as a point of reference and guide as we talk about the idea here of dealing with and addressing social integrity. So with that being said, do we have any last minute questions or comments? Because I kind of had a short class, but we hit on some real important points that will strengthen, our ability to be able to move forward as a people if we apply it. I mean, it's real, that cut to the chase as it applies to social integrity.
Yeah, no, I guess thank you. I feel like this conversation is definitely needed, and like so many things that you were stating were kind of things where I can kind of reflect and be like, oh wow, do I sometimes hyper look at my phone, right? If I am hanging out, or like, where I feel like every few minutes I have to check my phone, and like how to address that and how to change that and how to be aware of that. Yeah, so could provide some self-awareness. So
great. And we all can see how these patterns, play into us, because most of us, especially in this modern time, and within the United States, as people here in the United States, are impacted by this technology. But the position here is to have the awareness of what's really going on and how they can be weaponized and how they are being weaponized against us collectively. And as we see how this weaponization takes place, it actually gives us the ability to take power back. It actually gives us the ability to be conscious of what is going on, to the degree that we can form natural defenses against it. But if we're not even aware that we're under attack, again, not knowing that we're under attack, there's no way to form a defense against something that you don't even realize is happening to you. So opening up our awareness on a greater level to see in fact what is being done to us as a people, even from the standpoint of being provided to you as a quote unquote benefit, especially as it applies to the connection that we can possibly have now, to travel across the lengths of time, a length of distance without actually having to physically go there. So these things in itself are good tools and great things to take advantage of. The problem being is that we tend to form a false sense of reality around this, and having the ability to now create a virtual self causes people to opt out of real life scenarios and real life situations, because it is so easy from that standpoint to run into a brick wall. It's so easy from that standpoint to have obstacles that can render you unable to operate for a period of time, whereas on a virtual environment you can just click and delete and replace, click, delete, replace, and so it's so easy to get caught up in that type of addictive power, false sense of power, but nonetheless a perception of power. And that perception of power will replace people's reality in terms of achieving real power in the real world. Therefore, computer programmers tend to be what's referred to as the technocrats, and the technocrats tend to rule and manipulate the way the world is operating. And so from that standpoint, by building this virtual world for you to reside in, and all your quote unquote dreams can virtually come true, then it comes across as if it's something that can be that's needed, or something that is beneficial to you from that standpoint, all the while not recognizing how you are allowing your real life self, your real life personality, to be perceived in an environment that at any moment in time, especially being on the cloud, so to speak, can be zapped and taken away from you. And there goes your actual identity, because your virtual identity became who you wanted to be, your real identity. So it actually took on that same form, and you felt like you spent that level of quality time building it and acquiring it and getting followers, so to speak. And so we hadn't even gotten to the areas of what's referred to as social influencers. That's a class by into itself, talking about the power of influence and how that is a science in itself in the virtual environment. And people are taught techniques through neurolinguistic programming on how to go about addressing and dealing with all of your full attention and your full awareness within that environment, in order to generate, feeds to their channels and videos and so on and so forth, and the social footprint, which even dives into the idea of NFTs and virtual currency. All of that stuff is basically replacing real world environments. And as population increases, the real world environment is able to capitalize on that, because you're dealing with levels of of space that are limitless from that standpoint in a virtual environment. So with our focus of attention being centered around this virtualized world, and those in power using that for his benefit, it goes right back into one of the things that Elon Musk is preparing for, and that's creating an economy for humanity that is not based upon physical labor. And the reason being is so that people can be stabilized within these virtual environments. And by doing so, the human race takes on an entirely new role within its existence. And that's where the danger comes in. When we talk about how artificial intelligence now starts replacing real intelligence. And that's what a lot of people are not connecting the dots on. So the artificial replaces the real. And the real becomes something that is a relic of the past, or something that is a relic of being obsolete, rendered obsolete by the actual real people that have created the artificial. And so that's a whole study and discussion within itself. Anyone else want to comment before we close out? Let me hear something from you, brother Black Papa.
As far as technology usage, I noticed earlier you stated that you made the point about younger people, how it affects them. This also affects adults too. It definitely affects adults. I remember back when I was in the Navy in the mid 2010s, late 2010s. I might be an old man, and we had internet back then also. And I remember one thing that made me notice getting off the internet for a while, how it made you feel, is whenever we went out to sea. We had internet access out there, but there were points where it was the access was cut off depending on what we were doing, and so you would be out there for for weeks, or even even months, without internet. Initially, it sucks, but after a while, you kind of get acclimated to it. But then when you come back, you realize that it almost feels refreshing, because while you're out there with you're not connected, your stress levels are down, all these other things are occurring to you just inside your body, not even talking, not even discussing the outward benefits you get from it. But it's definitely a noticeable feeling whenever you're disconnected from from social media, or things like that can affect you mentally. It's a refreshing feeling. And even since I've been out the Navy, I've stopped using the internet as much as I like Facebook, for instance. I stopped using it when I was, I used to use it all the time, but now since I've been out, and I've been out for 10 years, I rarely get on there. People now even still have to contact me to check on me, because I don't use Facebook nowhere near as much as I used to. My life is a lot better for that, and I'm 38 years old. I'm an older man, and I felt that benefit, and it's a great feeling not having that unnecessary stress and all the other things that's associated with that. So it's definitely something that's definitely worth doing.
Thank you for that. Let me speak on the phenomena that you spoke upon in terms of being out at sea. The, the deal here is what's happening is when we allow our inner space or our inner awareness to have room to explore the vastness of what we are, you know, and I will go into saying who we are, when we are, where we are, why we are, how we are, and so on and so forth. When we have the ability and give ourselves the time to actually study self, that goes into what we said earlier about knowledge of self. We find out that there is a whole lot more to me that then I given myself the ability to know. And so because we've been defined by a virtual environment, or we've been defined by these things that have been projected and promoted upon us, then that is not my true self. Not only in the sense of the fact that we're talking about a virtual environment, but in the sense the fact that we're talking about other people that have defined our awareness and who we are based upon what options they have provided us. And remember, in our earlier training in Panther ideology, we talked about the difference between choice, options, and decisions. So when someone defines you, they eradicate and they remove your ability to have choice. Removing your ability to have choice removes your ability to be creative, your ability to be a visionary, and your ability to be able to navigate and dictate your direction in life. Whereas when others are providing you with intake and input and substance, so to speak, versus you providing that for yourself, then they control your destiny. And then now let me speak upon the emphasis on the younger generation so that it's not misunderstood. The reason why we focused on the younger generation is because when we talk about controlling the destiny, and we talked about the fact that the idea here is that each generation passes on its legacy to the next generation. So when we deal with the weaponization of social media, then it renders the younger generation, which is the one that creates the future, incompetent or impotent, so to speak. So when you render the next generation, the next in line, impotent, and it does not have the ability to self-replicate a great pattern, that's that devolve aspect that we talked about. That's why we wanted to go into the whole process of devolution and what it means on a collective level in regards to sovereignty as a collection of people. And we gave that example in terms of what was going on with the Native Americans and what and how they are restricted based upon Congress. And then we talked about the Washington District of Columbia, and then we talk about Puerto Rico. The reason we gave those examples is because when we're not able to recognize that the younger generation and how it's important that that generation is able to see the future and able to grasp hold of the future based upon learning from the elders and learning from the past, then what happens is that generation clips itself in terms of progression. And if it clips itself in terms of progression, instead of outpacing or beginning to catch up with the pace of oppression, it devolves and starts going backwards. And so now you have a greater divide as it applies to between the haves and have-nots, or the conscious and the unconscious, or the aware and the unaware, or the wealthy, whether we talk about mental, physical, or spiritual wealthiness, from those that are unwealthy. So that's why, and then within the Panther Party, keep in mind that our foundation is based upon raising the consciousness of the next generation. So what we're doing by having even classes like this is we want to help feed the next generation the type of things that they should know that the previous generation has already identified in terms of things that are not good for us, or things that we need to watch out for, or things that we need to do in terms of bringing solutions to the table. So that is the job of the elder generation, to be there for the younger generation to know these things without having to go through the whole process of re-experiencing something that was already experienced by another group of battlefield combatants. right? So if I've entered the battlefield and I've done my tour of duty, I've done my wartime, what I'm supposed to bring back to the next ones that are getting ready to come out is, hey, this is what's going on. These are the type of things you need to look out for. This is what's happening on the battlefield. So I supply the next group of soldiers with information that will save their life and prevent them from having to take casualties and losses on things that are already known on the battlefield. And so giving you that example kind of should hopefully our audience to help you understand what we mean, why we focus on the younger generation. So as I supply you with that knowledge, that information, and that wisdom of what I've experienced and what I went through, good or bad, it's irrelevant. The point is I'm giving you the tools to be able to go to the battlefield, and I'm equipping you with the right artillery to be able to now fight beyond where I made my mistakes. So in passing the baton, the idea here is that that baton represents the generational wealth of knowledge that can be passed to the next generation, that they will in turn pass to the next generation. And so we have an incline and we have a forward progressive moving mobility. And it was referred to within Marcus Garvey as backwards never, forward forever. We talk about that within the revolutionary organizations, group and grassroots movements. Backwards never, forward forever. And that basically means that we do not allow ourselves to ever get caught up in a position of devolving. In order to do that, we must prepare the next generation. So our focus will always be on the pitfalls of the younger generation. So in saying that, it's not that we're pointing out flaws of the younger generation, but we're pointing out to the younger generation the things that are happening to them in real time that I happen to know through my experiences that can be avoided. And therefore, I am teaching you, younger generation, and providing you awareness that you can then take and move this war to a new higher level of operation based upon that knowledge. And so this is in essence also what made the Black Panther Party breakfast programs so powerful, because what they started doing and what we continue to do to this day is we politicize the next generation. Because from that standpoint, politics is everything. And politics being everything, politics being how you govern, whether we deal with the individual, the family, or the collective, that self-governance, again, know thyself, is all about having the awareness of who you are as a people, regaining our position of self-determination. It's all about self-determination. So as we regain that as a collective and as a people, the proper place and perspective of the generations helping one another, the elder generation, middle generation, and the youth, providing that energy to move forward and that energy to continue the race. That's the continuity that we talk about, which is generational advancement, foundational. So from that standpoint, we emphasize the battlefield conditions so that the youth can take that knowledge base and that wisdom and move it to the next level.